Yeah.
So without further ado,
Thank you, Deirdre. Thank you all for attending. Yeah, as Deirdre was indicating, you know, when she was talking about the EDD writing retreat, I said, oh, I can think of a topic, because right away what popped in my head was a question I have been asked a lot over the years in courses by my own supervisees, not typically as grad advisor, but it can come up, and that is, what goes in a literature review and what goes in my theoretical framework? And so I'm just going to start sharing my screen, even though that I can't see your faces anymore, which is a little bit eerie, but hopefully that will still work there. And okay. So it's just one of those questions that comes up a lot. And I think it starts with people surveying either all the books on their shelves, the number of terabytes of PDFs they now have downloaded, or the stacks of papers on their desk, and thinking, okay, I've read all this stuff. Now, where does it go? And so my overall suggestion in this workshop is going to be to think about the functions that each of these sections serves in a thesis or dissertation. And so that kind of function approach is going to come out throughout, come through in the entire presentation. I'll go through some generalities. I want to give one example of a completed PhD dissertation that I think shows quite clearly how the research questions already set up what you would expect in the lit review and what you would expect in the theoretical framework. And then I might leave it to see what questions you have, because I think Tony sent out a request to say if people have questions about their own work, please bring those. If there are none, I can go and talk about a second example, but I might sort of set it up that way. So let's just start by reviewing the typical order of elements in a thesis or dissertation. Now, of course, Michelle just talked about nonconformity, and that will apply to the format of a thesis and dissertation as well. So I'm just going to show you a really, really typical empirical study format that can be messed around, but I think it gives you a sense of what components need to be there, right? So, okay, this is the basic premise. Not all the literature you read belongs in the lit review, and not all the theory you read belongs in the theoretical framework. So, okay, this is a really, I think, straightforward way of capturing what goes commonly in empirical, in dissertations or theses that are representations of empirical studies. So in the introduction, it doesn't allow me to use my normal buttons. There you go. You explain the broader problem or issue motivating your study. Sometimes people introduce with a little narrative. You state the overall, a larger question to which you hope to make some contribution. And then you also state your research questions, which are the more specific questions that your thesis or dissertation will seek to answer. And I'm happy to share these slides, by the way, afterwards, so no need to write this down. And all the images are open at our Creative Commons license, so we're good. So introduction, right? Typical setup, tell your reader what you're going to do, both the larger issue and your particular questions. And as you'll see in the example that I'll share, it's those research questions that set the reader up with particular expectations for what they're going to find in your literature review and in your theoretical framework and subsequent chapters. So the literature review, what does it do mainly? What is its function? Well, it explains to the reader how your research relates to, builds on, but is different from what we already know about your topic. It demonstrates that you know the scholarly field or areas of practice in which you locate your study. So that is your decision about how you locate your study. And it kind of makes, I always say it makes a sales pitch. It explains to your reader, my study will add something to what's already been done. The literature review sets the context. The theoretical framework is all about your study. It is an explanation of the theoretical perspective or perspectives informing the central concepts in your research questions. So that's, I will come back to that. Often it's already prefigured a little in how you frame your research questions. And because those concepts are often broad and there are many different theoretical ways of looking at those, think about something like power or identity or those kinds of concepts, you need to explain what conception of that concept you are using, whose views are informing the way you use that concept. Then your methodology, how are you going to go about answering your research questions that you stated in your introductory chapter? What specific method or methods will you use? And what paradigmatic and epistemological assumptions are driving your methodological approach? Then the findings chapters, it's often more than one, maybe it's two, maybe it's more, that's sort of I'm leaving that open. Typically you describe what you found, but also how your theoretical framework informed your data analysis. Sometimes you talk about how your data speak back to the theory that you started with, and you need to explain how the findings actually answer your research questions, or if they don't, why you've come to realize that you asked the wrong questions to begin with. And then finally, in the conclusion, you provide a summary of the contribution that your thesis or dissertation has made to the scholarly field or fields or practice. You often mention limitations of the study and areas for further research. This is a pretty standard kind of overview, and we can absolutely mess it up a little bit, but I think this is sort of a reminder of, oh yeah, right, there are these different parts, and these parts serve different functions, right? That's kind of the point. Now, what I hope has already come through a little bit is that the flow of a thesis or dissertation is often a lot like a funnel, right? So you start more broadly. You start in your literature review, which is often earlier in your dissertation, by describing what is already happening, what has already been done in your scholarly field or fields or your fields of practice. And then you narrow down to hone in specifically on what your study is going to do, what your study is going to add to what's already been done. So if you keep that model in mind, that may help you a little bit figure out what you want to describe where. So let's look at an example from one completed dissertation. This happens to be a PhD dissertation, but it's quite related to practice, and Deirdre will recognize it. And it's from Lilach Marom, who completed in 2016, who now works at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. And so I've just copied the section from her introductory chapter, which is now, of course, PDF available, that shows you her overall research question and the broken down research questions that she asks. So I'm going to read them out because they matter, and you need to, and it gives you a moment to think about, okay, if I were to read this, what kind of literature review would I expect to provide a context for this, to give me a sense that this author has credibility to add something to what's been done? What would I expect to read about what's been done? And what kind of theoretical framework would I expect? So Lilach asked, what conceptions of the good teacher are evident in the recertification trajectory of internationally educated teacher participants? So she focused on people who had already been teachers and been certified teachers in another country and then came to Canada. What conceptions of the good teacher are evident in the recertification trajectory of internationally educated teacher participants in this study? And how do these open up or close down spaces for IETs to bring their experiences and voices to bear on reconstructing their professional identity in Canada? 4 sub-questions. What different players do IETs encounter in this recertification process, and what conceptions of the good teacher, of the teaching profession, do these players convey? How are conceptions of the good teacher manifested in the trajectory, and particularly in the program, a particular program at a university that she studied? What kind of professional capital is embedded in conceptions of the good teacher? What kind of assumptions underlie this capital? And how do these assumptions intersect with race, ethnicity, gender, language, and immigration processes? Now, because her study was really concerned with the diversification of the teaching profession in Canada, in fact, that's one of the reasons people are concerned about the challenges that IETs are having. If you want to diversify the teaching profession, it'd be really good actually to be able to recertify people from other countries who have come to Canada and have already been teachers. One of the questions she needed to answer in her literature review as context is, what do we already know about diversity in the teaching profession? And specifically, what do we already know about diversity in teacher education in Canada? So that was one body of literature she reviewed for her literature review. The second body of literature that she reviewed specifically answered the question, what do we already know about the experiences and trajectories of IETs? And that, of course, took her to places outside of Canada as well, because there is research about internationally educated teachers. Sometimes a different term is used, but in different countries, with Australia, US, and so forth. She said, what can we learn from the research that's already been done? Now, what is the specific situation in Canada, and how does my study sit in the intersection of those bodies of literature? So that was her literature review. Now, what would we expect in the theoretical framework? How would she set up her own study? And one of the things you may realize looking at the questions is that there are a number of quite particular concepts that play a role here. One of them is professional capital, and the other is professional identity. And so one of the theoretical perspectives informing her study was the work of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. That's coincidence. Michelle and I did not coordinate that. All of a sudden, everybody's using Bourdieu. But right, she used the work of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and in particular his work on symbolic capital, looking at social, cultural, economic capital. And she focused on because she also focused on the tensions between the implicit understandings of diversity and the implicit understanding of the good teacher in these recertification programs, and the explicit discourse of we value diversity in teacher education. She also used critical multiculturalism, and in particular the work of Stephen May and Christine Sleeter. So when, where some of the questions indicate that there are these tensions, that the IETs themselves have ideas about what a good teacher might look like from their cultural background, there is discourse about the importance of diversity in the teaching profession in Canada. And yet they ran into some places in their experiences where it turned out there was less room for diversity than the discourse might have suggested. So this is just one example. Again, I have another, but I'm going to skip it for the time being, to say, okay, once you've got your overall problem statement and your research questions mapped out, that should already point you in the direction of what context you need for the study and what you need to say about the core concepts that inform your own study, right? And the contribution it makes to what already exists in the field. Okay. So another way of framing this is to say a literature review is more backward looking. It talks about what's come before your study, hence also my metaphor of it's the broader part of the funnel. And hi, Carrie. The theoretical framework is more forward-looking since your study is adding something new. So again, it's looking at the functions that each of these sections serves in the dissertation. Now I'm going to make one final point because sometimes you do end up discussing theory as part of your literature review. And now that can be confusing. So let me explain sort of how this can happen. When you review the bodies of literature that you have identified as relevant to set the context for your study, you need to organize that literature in some way that you choose as significant, that works for the particular bodies of literature you're looking at. So you might say, there are real clear trends that I might distinguish, and I might organize my literature chronologically. I describe how has research in the field changed over time. I might also organize it geographically. I might say, hey, I'm noticing research in the field is quite different depending on whether it's been done in the US or in Latin America or in China. And I'm noticing really clear, distinct bodies of literature that are worth mentioning. A third option is to describe your literature methodologically, to say, well, there's a whole bunch of quite quantitative research, large data on this topic. And then there's a smaller number of studies that have been done using qualitative approaches. And there might even be a small number that are ethnographic, right? I'm making this up, so you can organize it that way. It is also possible that you organize your literature review by the theoretical perspectives that have informed the research that has already been done in the field. Of course, if you do that, you inevitably end up talking about theory in your literature review. What's important to remember, however, is that this still serves a different function than your own theoretical framework. So if you discuss theories in your literature review, they are still distinct because they are still backward looking, right? You are still describing how theories have informed research that has already been done. And that is then distinct from your explanation of the theoretical perspectives that inform your study in particular. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for now and see first, so I can see you again, and see first if there are questions and perhaps examples that you would like to talk about a little bit that you might be struggling with. And if not, we can talk about another example of a dissertation where I've also got the research questions and we can look at what went in the literature review and what went in the theoretical framework. Let me see, I don't know if I see hands, but. Vanessa?
I don't know, this might seem kind of like a silly question, but I guess something that I'm struggling with is what makes something distinctly a theory rather than kind of a model or, you know, something else. And so deciding, you know, if I'm building on some of the literature that's come before, how do I decide which ones are specifically theories that are defining kind of how I'm using things operationally versus just, you know, previous models that people have come up with where I'm finding gaps in the model and kind of expanding. And yeah.
I think that's a great question. I wouldn't get too hung up on the term theory, right? And in particular, sometimes what happens is that, and you know, and in some ways I feed into that because of the example that I looked at. People look at like big T theory, big social theory, for example. Well, if it's not Foucault, if it's not Bourdieu, it's probably not theory. Yeah, except it needs to be relevant to what you're doing. So if you have scholarly work by someone, whether it is organizational theory, leadership theory, right, or some other specific that might not even be called theory as much in theory land, but it's informing the exact conceptions of the ideas you're using in your study, that's probably relevant for you to explain what you're doing. Now, the second part of the question is, the way I heard you asking the question is also that sometimes you just need a really practical kind of definition. There's a concept you need to explain, and sometimes you need to really elaborate on it. That's a really interesting one. We all use multiple concepts in our work. You can't write pages and pages about every single one of them, or you'd never get anywhere. So that is exactly where you as an author have to decide which are the key ones. They're also the ones that tend to show up in your research questions, and which are the lead actors and which are in supporting roles. And when they're in supporting roles, it's often okay to just be practical and say, I need to be clear. My reader should understand what I mean. So I'm pragmatically just giving a like I'm using this definition. When I say X, I mean Y, and I'm done with it. But when it comes to these core concepts that really are at the heart of your study, that are in your research questions and so forth, you need to go on a little more. So in the example that I showed, a concept like professional capital was very significant. And it can be understood in different ways. I mean, people can use kind of human capital theory in an economic way, right? It's really important that you explain not just that that's not what you mean, it's also important that you then show, I've understood Bourdieu's work, and this is why I think it's a good perspective to take for my study. So that's the kind of concept where more elaboration is required. Whereas at other times, there might be a more minor concept where you just need to explain what you mean and you know, it'd be 1 or 2 lines and you get on with it. So that's sort of a distinction. Now the other, you also ask sort of, if you find a model, an existing model, and what you're doing is kind of offering an improvement, then, you know, it depends. I mean, it could be one of those places where the model, and again, I don't know the specifics, right, of your work, but it could be that that is one of the models that you described in your literature review. And it can be part of the sales pitch of saying, this is what's been done. This is an existing model that's out there. This is what the model doesn't do. This is therefore a gap in the field I've identified, and I'm going to jump in that gap and add something. So if that is the function of describing that model, showing that it's been done, but it's too limited, then it would more go in your literature review. I see Naresh.
Yeah, hi, Claudia. Yeah, my question is, Claudia, talking about the literature review, like if your topic is such that there's so much literature available, or like so many people have done work on that topic, how to narrow it down? Like any particular tips about that, or any hint? Yeah.
In part, it depends on how you define your topic, right? So imagine, so let's think about the example of the dissertation I gave. So imagine that Lila had said, well, my topic is teacher education, obviously. So now I need to do a literature review on teacher education. Okay, at that point, she would have encountered way too much literature. So that is not the appropriate context for the study, because the study wasn't just about it wasn't about all of teacher education. It was specifically about recertification programs and the role of those recertification programs in attempts to diversify the teaching profession. So part of the problem may arise from your own definition of the boundaries of your topic, right? You can't, a topic tends to go on forever and ever. You need to decide where to set the boundaries. So that's sort of one hint. The other is there will still be areas where you say, I can't really narrow the definition of my field down much further, because I really can't sort of not talk about this field as it is. But what I can do is review some literature much more briefly or in the categories of research that exist. And I'd only select the most significant pieces or authors that have really become influential in the field to foreground them and discuss those in greater detail. So part of the challenge in a literature review is that you are not going to describe each text you read with the same degree of detail. You need to figure out what you background and what you foreground. For example, you might decide, look, there is a lot of really wonderful literature from before 1990 or from before 1980 in my field. I'm going to describe that from a greater distance with less detail to show the reader that I know it's there. I know broadly what was done at that time, looking at the trends, looking at the changes in trends, looking perhaps at the methodological approaches that were popular at the time, and to say, but I'm going to discuss what's been done after a certain date in greater detail because I think it's more pertinent to my study. So two things. One is how you define those bodies of literature, and the other is how you choose what you describe at greater distance and what you describe in more detail. Those would be my two suggestions.
No, great. Thank you.
Claudia, I don't know if you feel like you have time to share that other example.
Yep, can do.
That'd be great.
Okay. So this is a more recent one. I need to go back to share my screen. Okay. So this is a dissertation by Gang Li, which he completed just last year. And again, we need to go through the questions first. He said, my doctoral research aims to explore how Chinese international students are produced politically through their engagement with democracy while pursuing degrees at universities in Canada and the United States. And then he broke it down into three more specific questions. He said, how do Chinese international students engage with democratic discourses and practices in Canada and the US? How does this engagement affect the students' thoughts on and/or action toward democracy? And how do the students become and/or how are they made into political and possibly democratic subjects? So his literature review said, okay, look, there is a lot of research already on Chinese international students, right? So he said, okay, my research sits in the intersection, again, very common, of two bodies of literature. Sometimes it's three, sometimes it's 10. He said one of them is the research that's been done on Chinese international students already. He said, what I'm noticing is that research tends to focus on a number of specific angles. One is the role of Chinese international students in flows of finance and flows of labor and flows of skilled labor. The second is the pedagogical challenges that these students run into when they have when they move to different places. The third, I'm trying to remember, I think it was more on the specific role of these students as cash cows for Western universities. So it had more to do with the tuition models and the draw of bringing Chinese international students to Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and so forth. He said, well, that's very interesting, but those studies aren't really talking about what happens with these students when they experience forms of democracy in Western countries to which they were not exposed while in China. So that's not really happening there. He said there is literature historically, so that was the second part of his literature review. There is literature historically on the role of Chinese people who have gone abroad to Western countries and experience democracy there and then come back to China. There is literature on their role in further attempts to democratize China, but that wasn't specifically about higher education. So again, he said, I'm going to look at both bodies of literature, what's been done, and then I'm going to explain that I'm going to sit in the intersection of that to frame my own study. Okay, so that was about the literature review. Again, this is a clear example of how the research questions and how they're written kind of prefigure and give the reader a kind of sneak preview of what to expect in the theoretical framework, because there's a very specific framing already in the questions. And that's, he doesn't say, how do these students become democratic citizens? It says, how are these students produced politically? How do these students become or how are they made into political and possibly democratic subjects? One of the core concepts at play here is the idea of political subjectivity and how one becomes a subject, so theories of subjectification. So his theoretical framework was quite strongly informed by the work of Michel Foucault and Jacques Rancière, who both write on political subjectivity and processes of subjectification. And then he also drew on some work from Chantal Mouffe to talk about sort of politics and the political, because it really was framing his understanding of what was happening in their experiences with democracy. So that's another example where it gives you okay, there is the context. What do we already know about this issue? What do we already know about, like, how can you convince me, reader, that you're really offering something new, that this research like this on the role of international students today and their influence on democratization hasn't already been done. So that's what happens in the lit review. And then your own framing of the research needs to say, okay, wait, if you're talking about people becoming political subjects, whose work are you drawing from to inform your understanding of what that is and what that looks like? Why are you using subjectivity? Why are you talking about subjectivity? What is subjectification? Like, what do you mean by that? So that was the theoretical work that he used to inform his own study. And so this is an example where it's really quite distinct. What was in the literature review is quite distinct from what was in the theoretical framework. And it shows those functions quite well, I think.
Great example. Does anybody have a question? I know we're at time, but if there was a burning question, I think we could do it. We're leading into a 2-hour plus break here. Okay.